Great. Well, yeah, I'm just here to welcome you both. Heidi, nice to see you again. Robin, and you as well. And Robin is hosting a conversation with Heidi Brooks that I'm very much looking forward to listening in on myself. I find Heidi to be very insightful, and I'm sure you will as well. I just briefly about Robin. Dr. Stern is the co-founder and associate director at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And she combines her decades as a psychoanalyst and her groundbreaking work as a co-developer of the Ruler model to deliver really unique insights and ways of developing practical skills that can help you live and work with greater emotional intelligence. She's also a co-founder of OG and has helped us develop our training program that's available for adults. So with that, Robin, I'm going to hand it over to you so we can maximize the amount of time you have conversing with the great Heidi Brooks. And so with that, I will step aside and let you go for it.
Thank you, Andrea, for that kind introduction. And I'm delighted, Heidi, to be here with you. And for those of you listening, thank you for joining. I've had the pleasure and privilege to know Heidi for several years now and have become a student of her courses in everyday leadership, which we're going to hear about soon. And this summer, had the pleasure to be in Heidi's summer camp, which is a course on everyday leadership called Holding Space. And we'll get to that in a minute. But first, Heidi, I just want to ask you, how are you feeling right now?
Well, I'm pretty happy to be in this conversation with you. So I'm feeling kind of delighted. I'm particularly interested, intrigued, and a little fascinated with your calling the summer experience summer camp. No one else calls it summer camp. It's really it's a Robin Stern naming, and I love it. I love it. And for me, I was a kid who went to summer camp, and I loved it. And I hope that you were a kid who went to summer camp and loved it, rather than a kid who went to summer camp and hated it. Because that happens too.
I loved summer camp, and it was a place where we would just spend a lot of time being very thoughtful and talking about deep things and having important conversations that made me think a lot about myself. And I had wonderful experiences in summer camp. So this was another wonderful experience. So it is really wonderful and joyous, actually, to be with you now. And we are together at a time that is in the world very challenging, very difficult, and takes all of our skill and experience to move through and to care for other people and to teach other people. And so I just want to ask you, how have you been coping? What have you been doing to maximize your energy, to take care of yourself during this time?
Well, first of all, in some ways it's a more demanding time because of the chaos and uncertainty and vulnerability and, context of COVID-19 and questions about racial injustice. And in some ways it's a less demanding time because we don't have the benefits and joys of kind of going to the office and seeing other people. We also don't have the demands and duress of managing organizational politics or difficult conversations or travel or commuting or whatever might be stressing you out. So, on balance, I'm actually feeling pretty good. That said, I have a bunch of things that I do that I'm been have more time perhaps to do during this time. So, as you know, I spend a lot of time working with the group component of everyday leadership. And I believe in my field and what I do as a practitioner and also as a learner. It matters to me to walk the talk. So some of my coping skills are very much related to being a student in my field. So I create spaces for others, but I also participate in spaces that other people create. And some ongoing spaces that I participate in that I've been very active in over these past few months include a group that I've been part of for over 15 years, we met in a leadership development program, and a set of us started meeting. We call ourselves now The Edge. We used to be Vortex because groups change and grow and develop, and we outgrew our Vortex name and became recently The Edge for reasons that don't matter as much, but we used to meet twice a month, and I think we've moved to a little bit of a different schedule. We're more on kind of retreat phases now, but that group matters to me. I have another group that's similar. These are both unfacilitated. It's just a group of kind of senior practitioners who hang out together. Another group, we call ourselves For Colored Girls, from the Entezake Shange choreo poem. We happen to also be For Colored Girls, if you will. And we've been meeting for a little bit more than a year. The OB group that I'm part of at Yale School of Management, we've done a lot of meaning making together about teaching and being professionals in the way that we have been in a completely different medium. There's been a lot of meaning making. The lunchtime talk by Rodrigo Canales was wonderful today, so I've actually spent a lot of time with that group. And then, this whole
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah, please.
So can you get more granular? I mean, to give people a feel for what it's actually like to live everyday leadership, to actually be in one of those groups. Having been in one, I can say that it's really very stimulating and sometimes scary and very rewarding, and in the moment, and moment to moment. But I think I'd love for people to really know what you mean by living by emotional intelligence in action, which is how I think about it as well. And also, what does it mean to lead in the moment every day?
Yeah. Well, the next example I was going to give is kind of, just exercising a lot. And it's not like exercising a lot is really fun every moment, right? A lot of times you're stretching yourself and it's kind of painful, or you're trying to lift more weights or go further or faster than you have before. And, depending on what your idea of fun is, that might not actually be joyful. Meeting with these groups is kind of the same. Like, any given moment, I might actually be hating it and questioning, like, why do I do this? And at the end of the day, it's really about being limber and connected to myself and to others, and having really kind of strong muscles that are related to everyday leadership skills, that I can keep myself curious and able to connect with my own sense of empathy, and find humanity, including my own and others, worth fighting for, when actually I hate pretty much everything that you're saying and you feel the same towards me. So why stay in relationship? And so all of that they're like little workouts that we build muscle memory around and have to build the capacity for. So that I think very much about this work as kind of an everyday leadership gym, and all of these contacts and connections these are my partners, my practice partners, in the everyday leadership gym.
So why stay in relationship when you might hate everything I'm saying and I might hate everything I'm saying? Unlikely for us, but maybe one day,
Yeah, no, we do pretty well together, suspiciously well, perhaps, but I don't want to question that. So why stay in connection? I'm definitely on the romantic side of life. I have deep hope for humanity and what we're capable of individually and collectively. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we're more robust and resilient than we give ourselves credit for. I don't have kind of like dark and twisty thoughts about what humanity is for and about at the beginning or at the end of the day. I'm really a devoted humanist in that way. And because I have those convictions and beliefs about me and you and others, I'm regularly disappointed, right? Because while that concept exists, we don't necessarily live into it. And that's my concept. And so part of the cycle for me, honestly, in working with people, is that I have to be willing to have my heart broken. And my ability to kind of, resurrect myself like a phoenix from the ashes is, I think, a bit of the cornerstone of where I work from. I'm actually, I think, sometimes I think of myself, maybe others think of me as a kind of recovery and repair expert. So it's not just that I'm romantic. I'm really quite resilient. And a lot of the work that I do is, maybe at the School of Management at Yale, but also in my advisory, is to help groups, often more senior leaders, step into their aspirations to really create a lived experience for themselves and others of who they want to be, who they mean to be. And it turns out that's a hard thing to do. So a lot of that is actually recovery, repair work. That's really about going to the gym every day and getting stronger at being the person that you want to be, or the collective entity that you want to be.
So to use a metaphor, like, who took you to the gym the first time?
Who took me to the gym the first time? Well, I really identify as an athlete. I don't think my knees would necessarily agree these days, because I can't play as much tennis as I'd like to, and I certainly can't get on the basketball court and run the court anymore. But that identity sticks, and so I think about the work that I do and the work that I want to do with clients and with partners as a certain kind of athletic team. And I care about our, kind of wearing the same kind of jersey and really fighting for something. It does raise the question of who's the opponent. And the opponent might be our own shadow selves, kind of the version of ourselves that shows up when we get stressed or threatened, or even when we just get overly committed to our own comfort, and don't live into our aspirations. And so I don't need to create kind of enemies in people, and rarely do. And I'm regularly shocked when people don't love what I have to say or my presence. But I really love the feeling of being on a team and collectively fighting for something, kind of forming a joint platform around why we're here together, some sort of sense of shared purpose. I find it deeply enlivening for me. And I believe that we're here for purpose, and that finding and making meaning of our time together is part of the joy of living.
Yes, agreed. And I wanted to use that segue to speaking of the joy of living and living in this daily, in our lives today. I wanted to refer to the article that was your interview, How to Start Making Real Change in Your Organization. And I wanted to ask, what's alive for you right now about leadership?
Well, when that interview happened, the telephone was ringing in the background. I don't know if you can hear it on my side, but I always, try to integrate whatever's happening in context. And so in June, we were getting a call, right? We were getting a call to actually think about Black lives and racial justice. And I, like many people, was pretty activated in an angry way, and also in a hopeful way. So that article was written at a point in time. I may seem a little calmer now. I feel a little calmer about the issues. It's partly because the news cycle is dying. It's partly because my family and I have moved from New York City and New Haven, where we generally are, into our vacation location. So that, kind of calms down the spirit a bit. But that article was a really important, I think, conversation, and all of which was true for me. What do you want to know about it?
A couple of questions that I have, but let me take a step back from that, because I see a couple of questions in the chat room asking if you would just say a word about your background and what is the work you do at Yale.
Oh, sure.
And then we'll go back to the article. I won't forget.
Yeah, no problem. I have a Ph.D. in psychology from UC Berkeley, and I teach at Yale School of Management. I've been there since 2003. I teach a series of courses which start with a required course that I teach with Julia DiBignino and Michael Kraus, who are also on the faculty at the School of Management. It's called, we call it Power. It's called Power in Politics. And that course is really about the everyday journey that we all take, as well as the long-term journey about managing our power as members of organizations. And power is a difficult topic, and it's not a comfort topic. We have lots of skills, but not talking about power. But that course is required. Then I teach, for people who want a little bit more, I teach a popular course called Interpersonal and Group Dynamics that, of course, you know well. It's like the other summer camp as I start to generalize your reference. And that's a memory maker of a course, kind of takes over people's lives because it takes so much time. And I'm lucky that there are a number of facilitators who've been hanging out with me for years. We've got some very skilled space holders in there. So I sit as a faculty member, and then there's a facilitator community. And then the next course in that sequence is called Everyday Leadership, which is really taking a look at taking responsibility for your impact, where in the everyday leadership lens, I'm really interested in these kind of micro moments where we have choice and can recognize and take responsibility for our impact on ourselves and others. It's deeply embedded with an emotional intelligence lens, because most of everyday impact is about affective impact, how people feel when we're around or because of our presence. And then for the facilitators who are involved with this whole series, we have a course that you call Summer Camp that wears the title of Holding Space. And that's for the change makers. That's for the space holders who care about creating spaces where people can thrive and learn and grow in organizations. We face that towards this interpersonal and group dynamics course in large part, but really anyone can take it who's interested in building the capacity for your organization to be a place where we can actually have discussions that are meaning making, where we can recover and repair, where we can actually give each other feedback and be curious about each other, where somehow it becomes part of our capacity to be collectively robust together when it's not convenient, but really well worth the effort.
So what's the magic? Why is your course like the most popular elective at Yale School of Management? What's the magic?
Yeah, it's partly because people are just really hungry for an experience where they can be free with others who are interested in the same. And, we do so much. We're really very skilled at binding ourselves and each other into kind of performativity and reputation management. And this course shows a pathway to actually be more effective by doing less reputation management and trusting yourself more, and building a context where actually authenticity and the vulnerability that's inherent to being can actually be part of how you perceive and kind of project yourself. Not that vulnerability is the point, but it's a pathway to being known. And it's awfully hard to make your way as a robot in this world. You may overestimate the value of your task and kind of performance capacity if you take out all of the components that are about emotional intelligence and connection and trustworthiness. So we really need to do both. And this course really allows for people to both be known as competent. So we're not renegotiating that. We're just really adding and asserting the real primacy, or at least the primary importance of connection and emotional intelligence and trustworthiness, kind of the other axis of kind of power in our two-dimensional model of like competence and connection.
Yeah. So is part of the magic then the invitation to be vulnerable? And people are flocking to your class. People are spending like nights during the summer, like in these conversations, and they're hungry. And I love the conversations myself. I'm a devotee, so here I am, right? What my magic is, the magic for me really is outing the obvious conversations that are usually the subtitles of what's going on in any given moment around a table, in a classroom, at a conference table, right? So is that it, the invitation to be vulnerable?
I don't know. I mean, maybe you're speaking to it. People like amazing people like you show up and actually want to be known and know others and really work towards a collective capacity and a kind of microcosm of a world, like a little world where we can actually create a culture where being known, trying to be known, working together towards kind of being human better is the way. And it turns out it's not easy, right? So the summer pilot was really very advanced people, and part of the surprise, I think, reminder to all of us is that no matter how advanced we are, you actually have to go through the steps and stages of getting to know each other and learning to trust this particular group. Even if you know and trust every single member, the group coming together is like another entity. And the group has to go through the paces of creating safety and psychological safety and a place for people to talk and learn and grow. And that's, it's a little bit of a surprise for, people who are pretty experienced.
I think Andrea
is asking for something. We have to cut her out. Yeah. Did you give her what she needs?
I did. Andrea, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm tracking some really big questions in the chat, and so I thought I'd lay them out for you to see in what way you might want to address them. Probably the biggest one that's been asked is, can you describe a challenging experience around diversity or racism or microaggressions that get worked out in the leadership gym in a more useful way than the historic way? I mean, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, and maybe tagging into that conversation is also just how we in the workplace can deal with uncomfortable conversations. That was another question that came up. And then maybe on the flip side of that, how do you create a culture of curiosity where more of these positive attributes come alive, where we can be ourselves? So, like I said, big questions, but thought you might want to know about them before we ran out of time.
Thanks, Andrea. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe they're related to this idea of the magic that you were referring to, Robin. Because there's a way in which a lot of what we're doing in the everyday domain is invisible. So we think it's magic, but actually I think it might just be things that we take for granted, or tacit knowledge, or simple everyday things that humans just, in fact, can't help but do. Like, we all know how to listen in some functional way. We don't necessarily know how to listen to each other deeply, or to listen as a kind of leadership responsibility, or to listen from a perspective you cannot take yourself. So you and I think, wear different racial identities, think of ourselves in somewhat different ways. And it can be pretty hard to understand the experience of someone who has a different demographic identity than you do. So one of the things that happened over the summer, and this is my way of answering some of the questions in the chat, is that there were companies that were, and individuals who were kind of caught on their heels, sort of saying, why are we so surprised by what happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor? Why are we so surprised? Why are we not more prepared? In some ways, for those of us who are old enough, the kind of conversations around Ferguson weren't really that long ago. So if it's the case that practice helps prepare us and maybe makes us a little bit wiser, shouldn't we be a little bit wiser? And many companies, especially, finding themselves not wiser at all, not able to react, pretty caught off guard. So part of the idea of the leadership gym is to keep you in good shape, right? So if you went to the gym during Ferguson and you didn't go to the gym since then, you're probably in pretty bad shape. And I think that's actually kind of a fair comparison. So if you talked about race 6 years ago, and then you didn't talk about it for 6 years, didn't think about it much, didn't think it was relevant, it wasn't really in the news cycle or in your organizational conversations with urgency and the kind of, it wasn't about this quarter, it didn't get your attention or the metrics or the measurement, you're probably out of shape. And when you're out of shape, it's hard to run, and we had to sprint this summer.
Yeah, and I think something that came up in the article that I want to talk about, so this is a good time, is the we seem to be allergic to discomfort, to feeling discomfort in this country, and we talk a lot the Yale Center about becoming more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And these conversations, the conversations about Black Lives Matter, about even about going back to school and what's going to happen with racial justice, racial injustice when we go back to school, they're not comfortable conversations.
No.
If you cannot use, if you don't have strategies, if you haven't used the strategies in 6 years, or you never had them to begin with, well, one, now is the time to get them, and urgently. But you're not going to be able to step into that conversation because you actually don't know what you're going to do. And even if you have the courage to say what's on your mind, you get up the courage and you make a statement, you don't know what's going to come back at you. And then what? And how are you going to manage it? So I think people avoid that also because even after an encounter that might be authentic and full of curiosity and might even go well, then there's tomorrow. And what do you do when you're in that same conversation with that same person, but it's a day later and you had to realize that you were vulnerable? And can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the good news and the bad news that there's almost always tomorrow. It's really that you are accountable for your actions. Tomorrow should be part of our context of working together, so that it's not the case that you can just say any old thing out of reactivity and then pretend the next day that it didn't happen. I mean, you can do that, but it's a certain kind of organizational culture and context that allows that, and it usually only allows it for certain demographics, both in gender and race. And so, there's usually a little bit more of a kind of punishing or a certain kind of accountability for demographics that are in the minority. They just kind of can't get away with as much stuff. Mm-hmm. So, how do we kind of build a culture that can work? So part of it, I think, is to use your term, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. You really can build familiarity with doing difficult things. We can do difficult things. We're doing difficult things right now. And many people were quite surprised how quickly we moved into work from home mode. You might have seen a company plan for this for 2 years if it had been a kind of planned transition. We can do much more difficult things, and we can adapt to circumstances that may surprise us. So if there's a kind of, silver lining to this entire period, for me, as someone who believes in the power of experiential learning, we have a kind of the perfect platform for experiential learning. We have deep opportunity now to get wiser about how we can adapt, how we can actually have conversations that we experience initially as difficult, and these conversations are going to keep coming back about race. So around the kind of comfort thing, we have a little bit more of an addiction to comfort than is useful for our kind of like need for adapting to our future. A lot of people are saying right now, it's not, working from home, it's not the same. It's not the same. Being on Zoom or wherever we are, run the world. It's not the same as being in an office. That's true. But we might think about adapting for tomorrow rather than towards yesterday. I think virtual is here to stay in some aspect in our work lives. Work from home might be here to stay. So we might as well figure out how to adapt to that capacity. We also can get a lot better at perspective taking, at experiencing something that is not our own experience. Not by having had the experience, obviously, but by cognitively being able to stretch. It's an emotional intelligence skill to be able to understand other people's experience without necessarily having it. It takes some work and some muscle building. It turns out that if you're Black in the U.S., you probably have had that experience. We call it kind of double consciousness, and that you actually have to have some sense of how other people are thinking of you if you work in a predominantly white environment. People aren't necessarily aware of having this skill, but this idea that you actually can think both of yourself and how someone else might be perceiving you simultaneously in order to make decisions about how to survive and thrive maybe in the environment. And so it's a skill set that I think humans are capable of building. Underrepresented demographics have often had to build that skill. And so other people could choose to build the skill. It's really just a perspective-taking skill. And so it's tremendously valuable for collective and individual leadership effectiveness. I think that's part of the magic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because I know we spoke about it the other day, and when I read that in the article that you were interviewed in, it was so moving to think about the experience of having to maneuver in that way, to have reminded me of the work that I've done in gaslighting and in abusive relationships, where in order to survive, you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and see what they see and then manage yourself from that perspective. And it's exhausting and it's painful. And as I said to you, it is just an awful feeling to know that you or any other person of color or any other person in the world, people being abused all the time, have to go through that. And just that reminder that you were living that. And when you call that deeper empathy, yes, it is. You know, it's just being able to relate on a deeper level, and it is a skill. It's a skill that people can develop, and sometimes inadvertently develop, as I did in my life, just in the spirit of sharing. In the spirit of this conference and permission to feel, I had a relative, an uncle who was very out of control, and he regularly used to lock me in confined spaces, and he never touched me, never hurt me, but I learned how to get out of those spaces by watching myself perform through his eyes. And I was successful, and he was my teacher. And these experiences are our teachers, and how painful to have to go through it. Can you talk a little bit more about deeper empathy? What happens when people have deeper empathy? What happens when what would be different if leaders had deeper empathy?
Well, wouldn't that be a more fun kind of place to work if, an everyday leadership skill included a kind of empathy that could take perspective across the experiences of so many more people? And, thank you for going and looking for, like, in your own deeper empathy search as you read this article and, kind of been talking with me today. Thank you for that example. And I really appreciate the connection. And someone had asked us about kind of a culture of curiosity. And so maybe it begins with just kind of curiosity about other people's experience. But your example also points to being able to sit with other people's pain when it's not your experience. It's not your, idea of how the world works ideally. It's troublesome because maybe it implicates you in ways about, how do I create space and what do people experience with me? And this is not easy work. And so deeper empathy might not actually be experienced as fun or enjoyable. It's really the impact of it. It's a pathway towards impact for a kind of world of I keep talking about collective effectiveness, but, can we create environments where thriving is not skewed by demographic? And I think we're going to have to develop empathy for people who are different than we are in order to be able to create and craft that. I think it's worth going for.
Yes. Well, thank you, Heidi. And I think before we take questions, just what's your... God, there are so many takeaways, but what's one thing you'd like people to leave this session with?
Kind of little takeaway, news you can use kind of thing?
News you can use.
Well, maybe, kind of let yourself experience the kind of joy and power of beginner's mind. We get so addicted to being good and knowing what we're doing and managing reputation and the kind of performance capacity that we can demonstrate to others. And that, kind of compulsion to look good actually keeps us in some ways from being good. And so if you can let yourself create spaces and at least within your own mind and heart to let yourself learn to actually be better. You might actually, in shorter and longer term, be able to increase your skills to be the person that you're looking to project and to raise the bar on who or what that can be. And I hope, especially if you lead and have the capacity to create spaces or dream of yourself in that way, that you will set for yourself an aspiration of being able to talk about race. And I mean that if you are Black and listening to this call, I mean that if you are white, I mean that if you are young, if you are old, if you are a man or woman or somewhere else on the gender spectrum, we have to be able to talk about race. Our inability to do it is actually interfering. So I think everyone can learn to do it. And for those of us who have been had the lived experience that has inducted us into that skill set, make sure it's a skill set, not a reactivity set, and that we don't weaponize it for harm. You are justified in your anger and frustration, I want to say, and there's a way to be responsible for our impact. And, while other people are maybe hanging out trying to learn to talk about race, we can go to the spa for a little while. That wouldn't be so bad.
Heidi, thank you so much for your wisdom and your insights. And I just love being with you and so appreciate your saying yes to this invitation. Andrew, you have some questions for us?
Yeah, one that came up earlier on that I didn't want to ruin your flow there was about regulating disappointment. So as a romantic, if you experience a lot of disappointment, how do you manage that on a daily basis? Can you give us some tips or some strategies?
Well, because it's a regular roller coaster for me, I recognize it as part of the cycle of being me. It's just part of the cycle. The hardest part of the cycle is when it actually kind of touches like a crisis of faith, like, oh my gosh, this time humanity is not worth it. This time I'm running through the path. It's not worth the fight. So that's where I have to really kind of dig in and remind myself I've been here before and it's okay. But part of the point is that I actually am familiar with the cycle and can kind of talk myself out of it. And anybody who's worked with me knows that I talk about myself like this, and so I keep good company. So I can always call somebody lovely like Robin Stern who's going to be like, you're going to be all right. It's okay. It's worth it. And so I keep good company. But I think it is worth kind of knowing yourself and letting yourself have your process. It's actually part of my process. So what is your process? I don't have hope without the deep levels of disappointment. They go together. They go together for me. And so being able to tolerate and respect myself and my process is actually part of it. And for me, just a concrete thing, I really believe in being deeply centered as a leader. And being deeply centered isn't like a permanent state. You actually have to recenter. It's another repair and recovery process. And so in order to be able to speed that up so life doesn't throw me off too far and too much and too often, I practice different kinds of meditation. So yoga nidra is particularly good for the kind of roller coasters you're talking about. So yoga nidra has been my COVID summer 2020 buddy.
Yeah, and if you don't know what yoga nidra is, you're one Google search away from finding out. So feel free to check that out. It's a wonderful practice. Also, Heidi and Robin, a lot in this session and others, people bring up vulnerability as an aspect of both leadership and emotional intelligence skill. And I'm wondering if you could frame some thought around how we can think about vulnerability fitting into our skill set of being more empathetic or effective leaders.
Yeah, so vulnerability is a skill. It's not an end goal. So I really want to be clear about that. Like, vulnerability is not the point. We don't want people necessarily like having it all hang out, but we do want access to people. And it's hard to have people access people if they don't allow themselves to be known. Mm-hmm. And so part of the way that you can be known is to let yourself demonstrate and show your humanity. And by and large, what we mean by show your humanity is show that you have thoughts and feelings that aren't just perfectly formed and kind of robotic and distant in nature, that you have a kind of questions about yourself and the world. You are impacted and able to be impacted emotionally by others and by events that occur, that you have yourself questions about your own pathway or journey or impact, those are actually all okay. I mean, if we just look at simple reference points that are classic, like a kind of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Part of the journey is actually to question oneself. That's a process with honor, not a process with shame. And we also need to be able to tolerate our feelings like shame. It's just part of being human. Some people consider that bad news, which is why we try to be a little bit more robotic. But it's actually some of the gift of being able to be alive and in this world. So vulnerability is part of that process. To the extent that you're aiming to be invulnerable, it's going to be very difficult to create transformational space because you aren't able to transform yourself.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. That's so helpful. And I think here's the last big question I'll lob in your direction, and then we'll wrap up our session, which has to do with what do we do with resistant leaders? Like maybe I'm willing to do, I'm in the leadership gym. I'm willing to look within. I'm humble and I'm doing all the things. I'm doing the work, but I work for someone who absolutely won't. Or I've got peers or colleagues that won't. And so how do we navigate both our own self-care in that kind of environment, and can we nudge people into a place where that exploration can take place? Did we lose Heidi?
No, I'm right here.
Oh, there you go. Okay, all right, go for it. Mm-hmm.
Well,
you're back.
So I think you're asking about what do we do about the resistors and the kind of frustration of the resistors. Can you hear me clearly? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay. So, in some ways, this is change work. We're talking about organizational capacity building or individual capacity building. We can think about kind of reference points like the Cotter model of organizational change, and think about resistors as, kind of not very important in the beginning, right? In the beginning, we're innovating. We're interested in early adopters and their ability to be intrigued with kind of radical ideas and to learn about new ideas. The people who adopt early really help to convince the masses. Right. The resistors may never convert. So I always get worried about leaders or organizations that get very focused on the resistors early on, because it's a kind of black hole of effort. And so if you point all of your energy into the black hole, it can absorb all of your energy. And we need people who really care about creating organizations that have the capacity to learn, to produce a kind of broader sense of curiosity and capacity in developing a broader level of people and just developing leadership capacity. We need those people to be able to stay the course. And paying attention to the resistors eats up a lot of energy. So it's not necessarily the wisest move. That said, resistors often have an important message, right? They speak to a part of the culture. They can be 10 or 20%, or it may seem larger. So you actually want to segment down. Are they actually resisting? Or are they just not ready yet? They're just not ready for something that seems radical. They have to wait until it's less radical. That's not exactly resisting. That's like, kind of lower risk takers. So we want to kind of break down what we're really talking about. And really be wise about where you spend your time and attention. Early on, you want to build coalitions and get clear messages and have some things that are compelling. Speak to organizational values where people are basically saying, yes, I want to join you. And here's what I think that I can do. So you want to build energy and capacity with people who actually want to work with you. So be careful about how you spend your time. We really need sustainability for the people who are willing to lead the effort and kind of take an everyday risk to get out there and fight for the kind of world that they want to be part of and want to take a stand for.
Thank you.
I love that, the way you wrap that up with be careful how you spend your time, because it's ultimately part of what we say in managing your life smartly. Like, spend your time wisely. Mm-hmm. Right? So wisely, and seek out the people who you connect to and who have the same vision.
Which is a strategy in and of itself. So thank you, Robin. And a deep bow to both of you for the work that you're doing, for the support you're providing the change makers of the world so that we can live in a more equitable and empathetic society. and really appreciate all of the engagement in the chat today and the participation in our sessions, and look forward to another great day tomorrow. Thank you so much, Heidi. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Take good care.
Thanks so much.